So, picture this. France, back in the day, decides it wants a bigger empire. Africa looks like a pretty good spot to expand, doesn't it? Lots of land, lots of resources. And so, French ships start showing up on the coasts of West Africa. They weren't exactly tourists looking for a beach vacation, let me tell you. They came with flags, soldiers, and a whole lot of plans. It was less of a friendly hello and more of a, we're moving in, hope you don't mind. Or more accurately, they didn't really care if anyone minded. This was the beginning of a long, complicated story for many African nations, a story whose chapters are still being written today, often with a French accent. Countries like Burkina Faso, which was then called Upper Volta, and Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, if you're feeling fancy, suddenly found themselves painted blue, white, and red on French maps. They became part of Afrique Occidentale Française, French West Africa. How did they become Francophone, you ask? Well, it wasn't because they all collectively decided to sign up for French classes. The French language, French laws, French schools, they all became part of the deal, whether people wanted them or not. It was a full package, delivered with military precision. Imagine someone redecorating your entire house and telling you it's for your own good. That's kind of the vibe we're talking about here. The initial arrival was, to put it mildly, a bit of a shock for the local kingdoms and communities. France came with a powerful military and a belief that they were bringing civilization. They talked about progress, about modernizing these societies, but progress often meant building roads to get resources out, not necessarily to connect local villages for their own benefit. It was a one-way street, paved with good intentions that somehow always led back to Paris. The local populations, with their own rich histories and cultures, were suddenly expected to assimilate, to become a little more French, a little less African. It was a tough pill to swallow, especially when it was being forced down your throat. And this leads us to where things stand today, in 2025. That initial bonjour has echoed through generations. The relationship between France and its former colonies in Africa is, well, it's complicated. As they say on social media, there's a shared history, a shared language for many, but also a deep well of resentment and a growing demand for a real, genuine break from the past. It's like that family member you have a long history with. You can't just erase them, but you also really need them to stop telling you how to live your life. The French presence, in various forms, has lingered, creating a dynamic that many Africans are now actively trying to redefine. So why exactly did France pack its bags and head to Africa? It wasn't just for the sunny weather, though I hear Dakar is lovely. The main reasons were pretty standard for colonial powers, resources, power, and a dash of that civilizing mission rhetoric. Africa was rich in things like cocoa, coffee, cotton, and minerals, and France wanted a piece of that action. More colonies meant more global influence, a bigger seat at the world table. And of course, there was the idea that they were doing a favor to the less developed parts of the world by bringing them French culture and administration. Think of it as an extreme makeover, Empire Edition, where the original occupants didn't actually apply. To make all this happen, France had a well-oiled colonial machine. First, you send in the military to establish control. Then, you draw lines on a map, often completely ignoring existing ethnic or political boundaries, creating countries that sometimes made little sense on the ground. This is how you end up with straight lines dividing communities that had been together for centuries. After that, you set up an administration, install French officials, and start collecting taxes. Local chiefs and rulers were either co-opted or sidelined. It was a systematic takeover, designed to ensure that the colony served the interests of the motherland, France. Resistance was met with force because, liberté, égalité, fraternité apparently had some geographical limitations. In Ivory Coast, for example, France had a keen interest in the agricultural wealth, particularly coffee and cocoa. French military presence, like the 43rd Infantry Regiment, which later became the 43rd Bima, was there from early on, essentially to safeguard these imperialist interests. Their job was to make sure the colony remained profitable and compliant. This wasn't about protecting the Ivorian people, it was about protecting French investments and ensuring the smooth flow of goods back to Europe. The infrastructure built, like ports and railways, was primarily designed to get these resources out of the country as efficiently as possible. It was a business model, with France as the CEO and Ivory Coast as a very productive, but not very well compensated, branch office. Burkina Faso, known as Upper Volta during the colonial era, had a slightly different, but equally important role in the French colonial empire. It was seen largely as a reservoir of labor for the more coastal colonies, like Ivory Coast. Many Burkinabe men were recruited, often forcibly, to work on plantations or infrastructure projects in neighboring territories. The French carved up the territory, sometimes attaching parts of it to other colonies, then reconstituting it, all based on administrative convenience or economic strategy from Paris. This constant redrawing of lines and exploitation of labor left deep scars and contributed to the challenges the country would face even after gaining nominal independence. It was a tough gig, being a piece in someone else's grand imperial puzzle. Then came the 1960s, the era of independence. Flags were lowered, new anthems were sung, and African leaders proudly declared their nations free. It was a big party, a massive sigh of relief. Finally, countries like Ivory Coast and Burkina Faso could chart their own destinies, right? Well, hold your horses. Formal independence was one thing, but actual real-deal sovereignty? That turned out to be a bit more elusive. It was like breaking up with someone, but they still keep a key to your apartment, just in case. France wasn't quite ready to completely let go of its influence, and it had ways of making sure its voice was still heard, loud and clear. One of the most visible ways France maintained its presence was through its military. Even after independence, many Francophone African countries signed military agreements with France. Take Ivory Coast, for instance. They signed deals back in 1961 that allowed for continued French military maneuvers. These weren't just symbolic gestures. French troops remained stationed in many of these countries, often acting as advisors or peacekeepers. But as we've seen, their presence could quickly shift to active intervention if French interests were perceived to be threatened. It's like having a security guard who also happens to be your former landlord, and he's very interested in how you're managing the property. And oh, the political drama! France was often accused, and sometimes quite openly, of playing kingmaker in its former colonies. In Ivory Coast, President Alassane Ouattara's rise to power in 2010 notably involved French military intervention. There were even reports that France supported Ouattara in an earlier armed rebellion in 2002, which led to a civil war that split the country. French troops then positioned themselves between the warring factions, effectively cementing that division for a while. It's a bit like a referee who also owns one of the teams. You can imagine how that might not always lead to the fairest outcomes, especially when elections were reportedly manipulated, and French troops even bombed the presidential palace in 2011 to oust the incumbent. Beyond the military and political maneuvering, there were the economic ties that bound these nations to France. The CFA franc, a currency used by many Francophone African countries and historically pegged to the French franc, now the euro, has been a major point of contention. Critics argue it limits economic sovereignty and benefits France. Infrastructure, as mentioned earlier, was often geared towards extracting resources for export rather than fostering internal development or regional trade between African nations. Education systems, while providing literacy, also promoted French language and culture, sometimes at the expense of indigenous knowledge. It was a complex web of dependencies, making a clean break incredibly difficult. Fast forward to more recent times, and you can feel a shift in the air. There's a growing wave of anti-colonial sentiment, particularly in the Sahel region. People are tired of the old dynamics, tired of feeling like their countries aren't truly their own. In places like Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, we've seen military coups between 2022 and 2023, often fueled by this popular frustration. These new leaders have been very vocal about wanting to end French influence, leading to the expulsion of French troops. It's like these countries are finally saying, "Thanks for your input, France, but we'll take it from here. And please, leave your advice at the door." This pushback has led to some interesting new alliances. Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, after kicking out French forces, formed the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. And who did they cozy up to? Russia and the Wagner paramilitary group. Now, that's a plot twist. While this move is celebrated by some as a bold step towards sovereignty, it's also raised serious concerns, particularly from Western observers and human rights groups, about potential increases in human rights violations and abuses. It's a classic out of the frying pan, into the fire situation, or perhaps just a desperate search for partners who don't come with the same colonial baggage. Only time will tell how these new relationships pan out. France, meanwhile, isn't just packing up and going home entirely. It seems to be adapting its strategy. Think of it as colonialism 2.0, the discrete edition. With its large bases closing in some countries, France is reportedly shifting to a less entrenched, less exposed model. This means smaller, more dispersed troop deployments, focusing on technical assistance, training partnerships, and embedding personnel within local military and government structures. We see this in places like Benin and Chad. It's a way to maintain influence without being such an obvious target for criticism. It's like they're trying to be the subtle background music rather than the lead singer. So what does the future hold for these Francophone African nations? The local perspective is clear. There's a deep yearning for genuine independence and self-determination. Leaders like Bassirou Diomaye Faye in Senegal, who came to power in early 2024, are promising to end neo-colonialism and redefine partnerships. He even announced the withdrawal of all foreign troops by 2025. But the struggle is ongoing. Is this the dawn of a truly new era, or will old patterns simply re-emerge in new disguises? It's a complex, evolving situation, but one thing is certain. African nations are increasingly determined to write their own scripts, and the world is watching closely.